Just a real quick walkthrough. If you are trying to create your own food web and you just want a little bit of a review, here you go. So, how to read your food web or how to create a food web correctly, right? You want to make sure that your food web includes multiple food chains. Okay, so it's basically a menu of options that each organism could eat. You want to make sure that you're including different trophic levels. So they're here. We're going to go through those in just a second. But you always want to start with a producer, right? They're always at the base. Your producer is going to be more than likely some kind of a plant that can produce their own energy. And then something will come along and consume that. Okay. Your direction of your arrows to connect everything, the direction that it's pointing is absolutely important. The arrows are going to show, there's a couple ways you can look at it. The arrows point at the mouth that the animal is going into or the organism's going into, right? So it's going into what mouth? That's the direction that you're pointing. It's also technically the direction that the energy is flowing, right? So if something's getting eaten, its energy is going into the next organism. It's going into that mouth, but it's also going, their energy is going into that organism. So the direction of arrows is very important. Determining what trophic level an organism is at based off of that specific food web. That's really important too. Here are some options up here, and we'll go through those in a second. Being able to look to see if there's some kind of competition going on. So if there's an arrow for one organism and it is going into the mouths of multiple other organisms, that means they're all competing for that food source. So that's competition right there. Okay. The rest of this down here is talking about, again, the direction of the arrows, but then a 10% rule. So when you're starting a producer, they're just sitting there, they're getting 100% energy. They are making their own energy from the sun, right? So they just sit there fully charged, if you want to think of them as like an iPad, right? Fully charged. And then something comes along and they eat that plant, they eat that producer, right? They're getting 10% of the energy, right? Because what happens, they burn energy as they move along. And so for each round of the trophic levels, each layer only gets 10% of the layer prior to that. So we'll show you a visual of that in a second too. And then just knowing that one part will always impact the other. So if anything happens to any of the organisms in an ecosystem, they all end up getting something done to them, right? It's going to affect them in some way, shape, or form, more than likely. Okay. So here's that picture I was telling you about. Oh, our producers are sitting here. They're full of life, full of energy directly from the sun, right? And then a bunny comes along and they eat it, right? So the bunny is going to actually get 10% of the energy from the plant itself. Okay. They are going to be able to, use it, obviously, like any other living organism. They're using it in order to sleep, for their blood to flow, for them to run around, for them to eat, for all of these things, right? So when they're using the energy, it leaves their body as heat, actually. But it leaves their body. So when the snakes come along and they eat the bunny, they're not getting that full amount, right? The bunny itself used a lot of energy. So when the snake comes along and eats the bunny, there's not a lot left to pass along, right? So when the snake eats it, the snake's only getting 1% of that original amount from the plant. And then the snake slithers along and it needs to breathe and its blood is flowing and then it's eating and sleeping and doing all of the moving that it needs to do. And so it's burning all of that energy off. It's released in the form of heat back into the environment, right? And so when the hawk comes along and eats the snake, there's nothing left for that hawk, right? That snake used up as much energy as it could possibly use up. So now when the hawk eats the snake, he's only getting 0.1% of the original energy from the plant because so much of its energy was used before it even got passed along to the hawk, right? So this is a very simplified version, but technically this is showing you that the more organisms introduced into a food chain, the less energy that top guy is going to get. Okay. So that's the whole reason why there's a whole bunch of plants and not very many hawks, right? There's just not enough energy out there to really support the lives of a bunch of hawks. So it tends to be like a population pyramid as well as an energy pyramid, right? So there's a whole bunch of plants, there's 3 bunnies, there's 2 snakes, and there's 1 hawk, just to kind of represent the fact that the higher up you go on this food chain, the fewer organisms are going to be able to survive because there's just not enough energy to go around. Okay. So here we go. The producer is always at the base. So these are our producers, right? The first thing that comes along and eats is called the primary consumer. It's the first eating organism. So this bunny is the first thing that's eating, so it's considered the primary consumer, right? Anything that comes along and eats the primary consumer is the secondary consumer, right? The tertiary consumer would be eating after that. And in this case, it happens to be the apex predator as well. Okay. There's not always going to be the same amount of levels to your trophic levels, but that's the general pattern that they go. So in this instance, we don't have another level. We don't have a 4th level consumer. Okay. But anyway, so this just proves to you every time you're talking about a primary consumer, the first consumer in a food chain, they're always going to be herbivores. Because look at this, they have to eat the plant. Something has to come along and eat the plant first. Okay. So those primary consumers are the ones that first eat a plant. From then on out, it could be something that eats a plant or an animal. Okay. So just to have a little bit of background on that. Trophic levels. Okay, this is also screenshots from our Ed puzzle as well. So when we're talking about trophic levels, it's just telling you the different levels that there are in an ecosystem and what the like category they tend to eat, right? So here is a producer, right? The first thing that eats a producer is the primary consumer, right? They consumed something, they ate something first. So they were primary. Secondary consumer, they come along and they eat, right? So that's what we mean by those, right? And here's just another example. 10% of energy is passed to the next level, right? 90% is used or is lost as heat. So as you go down, you see that plant sitting there, ooh, all 100% of that energy, but by the time the grasshopper eats, it only gets 10% of it. And then it goes down from there each time. Okay, so that's why there are fewer hawks than there are grasshoppers because there's just not enough energy from what they eat. Okay. So here are the bigger screenshots. So we have our first level is our producer, right? They're called autotrophs, right? They automatically create their own energy. They don't need to eat anything. They're considered the bottom of the food chain, the base of the food chain, but they're the most important. They carry all the energy. Everything else depends on it for energy, whether they're eating it directly or indirectly. Okay. Decomposers, for some reason, they never put them on food chains, but they're really important, right? They can feed on anything, right? When it dies, those are the decomposers. They are there to put everything back into the soil as nutrients. They're the whole reason why the whole cycle of life works. And then we have our second level, right? Which is the first thing that's going to eat a plant, right? First thing that's going to consume, a primary consumer. And they have to be herbivores because they're the first ones to eat, right? But then when you move on, if you have the secondary consumer, they could be munching on plants or they could be munching on, oh my goodness, or meat. Sorry, brain fart. Okay. So yeah, once you start moving up, they could actually be either or. So that's where the omnivores come from. Okay. Moving on from there, that's our tertiary consumer, right? So they're the ones that are feeding on secondary. That means, again, that they could be feeding on omnivores or they could be carnivores. They could be either one. Okay. So sometimes this high up, they can still be considered plant and animal eaters. Okay. And then once you get beyond the tertiary consumer, sometimes the tertiary consumer is your apex predator. It just depends on how long the food chain is, right? So this guy could be considered the apex predator if the hawk didn't live in this environment. Okay. But they do. So once you move beyond that, if something is present and available and it's eating the tertiary consumer, then you're considering it the apex predator. Okay. But either one technically could be as long as they're last on that food chain. Okay. And here we go. Here is kind of what it would look like when you guys are labeling your own. So notice how they used different colors for the food web. I really like that. I think that's cool. Make it stand out. They use pretty basic pictures and they have the labels, right? So your producer, it always has to start with the producer. Your food web starts with the producer and it has to go to a primary consumer. Something has to eat first, correct? And then a secondary and tertiary. So if you notice it, if they wanted to, they could go in a different direction, couldn't they? They could do a bunch of different arrows and a bunch of different colors. They just happen to choose this one specific food chain to label, but you could definitely label all of them. Okay. So in this example, hopefully you can notice that there are two different producers, right? And the quaternary consumer at the top, right, is also our apex predator, correct? Okay. So that was just a quick run through of our food webs versus a food chain, the trophic levels, okay, and what they stand for, and how everything's interconnected, right? And how much energy gets passed along. So I hope that helps you guys. That is it.